Tell us about your friend and colleague, David Berliner, and how you met him.
Yes, I arrived at Stanford in the summer of '68, and I had the fortune or misfortune of walking down the hall trying to get familiar with the building that I would be working and teaching in. And as I passed the rooms, one of the faculty whom I did know casually said, Levin, oh, you're here now. What are you doing now? And I said, I'm walking around in shorts and sandals. Just, oh, good. So you have a little time, right? I said, it was the wrong answer. I said, yes, I have a little time. He said, good. Would you be willing to join us for a dissertation hearing? And I said, I'm sorry, a dissertation hearing? My understanding, and I had never been on a dissertation committee before, is that you actually read the dissertation before you can be on the hearing. And he said, well, that's the normal procedure. And we have enough people who have read the dissertation, and this particular candidate is extraordinary. But legally, we need a regular faculty member because one of our faculty members is sick or didn't show up. I don't know what happened exactly. I just don't have a recollection. So would you fill in for that faculty member? So I figured, listen, make your colleagues like you. I want to be liked. So I said, okay, sure. So basically I stepped into the room, and the doctoral candidate was David Berliner. And so I sat and listened. I'm sure, I don't remember what kinds of questions I had, but I'm sure that they weren't very well informed. But I thought, this guy is extraordinary. I mean, this guy is so competent. And he was answering other people's questions in such a competent way that eventually, of course, I voted in favor of his receiving the degree. So that's how I met David Berliner. I met David Berliner by being on his tribunal, being ignorant of what he had done and of his field, but nevertheless, in the proper way, judging him, okay?
You unleashed him on the world. We have you to thank for that.
Yeah, it was a summer, and it would have been difficult to find someone else, particularly in close proximity. And he was almost on the plane in terms of his new job at the University of Massachusetts. So it was important to do.
So not only were you the first member in the education economics faculty, David credits you for helping to found the field of educational economics entirely. He thinks that's your most significant accomplishment. He and Martin Carnoy noted that all of you had lots of adventures, academic and otherwise, shared a love for Latin America, and you and Martin formed a Center of Economic Studies in Education, particularly to protect yourself in case you didn't get tenure.
That may apply more to Martin than to me. Martin is one of the most productive economists. I mean, if you look at his career, and he still is one of the most productive economists. I mean, he's doing books on Cuba, on China, and Brazil, and these are books that are being very, very well received. But I think it's fair to say that Martin was a more controversial personage than I was. Martin, it would take up the challenge, the cudgel, as they say, very quickly, and the result was that Martin got his tenure much later than I received mine, even though we were probably comparable in terms of qualifications and output at that time. So I believe I got tenure in '73, and I think we started the center about that time. And Martin didn't get tenure until, I think, '77 or '78.
Tell us about the time you and Martin were in Paris and met with an official from the OECD.
Martin and I were very, very interested in the '70s in all forms of democracy. And so we had projects with that Center for Economic, can't even remember the name of it now, it's Center for Economic Studies. Our offices were in a church. We're in this very liberal Presbyterian church in Palo Alto. And the reason the church let us do this was because of the emphasis on democracy and on social movements and things like this. And so as part of that, we went to countries and to agencies that were supporting this movement, the idea of worker self-management, democracy in all of its forms in the workplace. Our basic premise was that if you don't have democracy in daily life, it's very difficult to have a political democracy. People voting for some representative every few years is not the same thing as engaging in democracy in daily life. And the most authoritarian, even more than schools, the most authoritarian organization is the workplace. And that democratic workplaces, we believed, were more productive than authoritarian ones. And there was a movement around the world in the 70s, centering more in Europe than in the US. So we did take this trip. This is our European trip. And in Paris, we decided to visit the person at the OECD who was responsible for the work being done in democratic workplaces. He had been told by the person who had set this tour up that we were a bunch of Marxists. So we came into his office on May 1st, 1975, and he said, okay, he said, you're here. I will tell everyone that you interviewed me. Now you can go out to your May Day parade, which, you know, it's a big parade in Paris on May Day. Okay. We said, no, we're really quite seriously interested in finding out what your plans are, what you're doing, and so on. He was very skeptical, but began to warm up to us. And so after the ice was broken, we opened up little kind of journalist books, journalist notebooks to take notes on our interview. He got very suspicious and said, what are those? And we said, oh, well, we have colleagues in Palo Alto. We have to take notes. We're responsible. You know, we're here, but we have to take notes so we can report back to them what we've learned. Okay. He continued to warm up to us and become very nice and even say things like tongue-in-cheek. So, for example, he started to say, you know what's behind this movement in the U.S. It's basically just to fool the workers and to get them to be more productive, higher productivity, but make them think that they're participating in the workplace. He said, with one exception, he said, we had a conference about a month ago, and there was a guy from Exxon here. And he really pointed out that what was at the base of this movement in the U.S., that had little to do with democracy and participation and had a lot to do with just increasing worker productivity to increase profitability. So when your revolution comes, don't kill him. Martin then picked up his notebook and said, could you give us the precise spelling of his name and, if you have it, his present address? The guy just froze. Anyway, we kept on parrying back and forth, and that way, you know, he would make tongue-in-cheek and cynical remarks, and then we would respond. He had a lot of when the revolution comes.
That's funny. Tell us about the book that you and Martin published together, Schooling and Work in the Democratic State.
That particular book, Schooling and Work in the Democratic State, was based upon a more complex picture than a lot of radical critics of schools had suggested. The really influential work, which happened to be, I think, Bowles and Gintis mainly, was very bright. It was brilliant, but it built on what is called a functionalist structuralist model, suggesting that schools, all of the institutions of schools, correspond with those of the workplace, and that schools are there simply to reproduce labor power for the workplace and the social relations of production so that they work in a way that fulfills the requirements of the capitalist for profits and for capital accumulation. Workers are divided against each other. They work for external rewards rather than for intrinsic rewards, symbolic rewards. They work because they want to be promoted. They're worried about losing their jobs, failure. All of these have parallels in schools. And so as we analyze school institutions, look to see how they're reproducing capitalist relations of production. And it's a very strict and so-called instrumentalist model because everything is instrumental and deliberate forming. And what we did is we raised the following question. We said, schools are not part of the capitalist order. They're part of the state. And the state has very different dynamics than the capitalist order. And there are some big differences between schools and the state. Example, if you look at schools and the way they treat gender, the differences, even in those days, are very small and in some cases favor females. You don't find that in the workplace. Mm-hmm. If you look at all the unfairness and inequity in educational finance, and there was a lot of it in those days, more in those days than today, because of the property tax and differences among states. But the bottom 20% in terms of investment in education gets about 1/2 of what the top gets in terms of spending and the numbers of years of schooling, so more years of investment. But if you compare the wealth of the top 20% to the wealth of the bottom 20%, it's infinite. That is, it's so much larger. So that the inequalities that you find in the work sector and capitalist sector are far greater than they are in things like schools and in the public sector. And why is that? Because there is something to the fact that democracy has an influence on the public sector. And in democracy, there's more of an emphasis on protecting those at the bottom of the order. And et cetera, et cetera. So that the state, the dynamics of the state and the dynamics of capital are quite different. And there are points at which it's possible for them to come together in a very, very reforming kind of mode. And then what we argued is that history shows that in those unusual times of confluence, where the state with its tools, the courts, legislation, and so on, come together to push for greater equality. Civil rights movement is a good example, the women's movement and so on, that they come together because the most powerful tool of democracy is that of social movements. And the capital has its resources as well. It can promote an ideology. It has obviously a lot of economic power, even the purse strings to a large degree of the state. So there are these strange intersections that are both colliding, but they might come together around various challenges. Why is it that the capitalist sector eventually embraced the civil rights movement and supported it, even though it discriminated badly against blacks and the rights of enterprises to serve whomever they wanted and so on, which was equivalent to separating out blacks. And so basically what we tried to do is to show a dynamic picture, historical picture, that was different than that of Bowles and Gintis or Michael Apple or Giroux or some of the other critics, acknowledging that they did have some good points in their work, but that in the larger view, this notion of social movements and two different dynamics and studying how they either are in conflict or come together through a common confluence of interests over time. So that was the heart of our book. And it turns out that even though the book is now out of print, it actually is still pretty active.
Martin notes that of all your significant accomplishments, he thinks your best work was figuring out how schools work effectively and communicating this both to educators and economists. You also did a lot of important work on school finance, which fed into your research on the working of schools, and he notes that. Among your earlier works in finance at Stanford, you defined the concept of cost effectiveness and argued that policymakers, educators, and the public must better understand how to evaluate competing alternatives to inform future investments. How far have we progressed in this area?
We haven't really progressed very much at all. I started my work on cost effectiveness. I published my first article on cost effectiveness in the Journal of Human Resources in 1970. It's 41 years ago, almost 42 years ago. And although it had in it some of the very things that today we're emphasizing, the idea of maybe it's worth paying teachers more and getting a more select pool, because what we found from the Coleman data were that teachers with higher, in this case they were just vocabulary scores, but let's say test scores, actually had better results with their students than hiring teachers with more experience but keeping the academic qualifications at the same level. Mm-hmm. And today that's being increasingly recognized. You know, let's pay more, let's get a teacher supply where we can choose more talented people and keep them in the system and nurture them and all of those things. But the fact of the matter is that for whatever reason, cultural or other reasons, cost effectiveness is not part of educational decision making. And so it hasn't been a great success. I mean, if you look at my career, a lot of the things that I really believe in and have worked on have not gone anywhere. And that's one of them. The only place that they've gone is we've produced a number of books and articles and things like this. The books actually get cited quite a lot. The two editions that I did of the cost effectiveness book have been cited more than 800 times according to Google Scholar. So people cite them, they just don't use them.
Particularly policy.
They get them into their bibliographies, you know.
Sure.
Yeah.